Good day, Industrial Advisor listeners, and thank you for tuning in. If you have not subscribed, please do so by clicking subscribe wherever you podcast. Click the like button and hit the bell if you want notifications of when we put up new content. Leave us a comment about anything we discuss here today or general comments about the show. Now, let's get into it.
Welcome to our Industrial Advisors podcast. You have Bill Condon and Matt McGregor, and today's topic is going to be the Puget Sound industrial market and how it's developed, basically, the progression of the industrial market. We're going to take a look at the history of it and where it started and where it is today and kind of where we think it's headed. So, Matt, why don't you kind of start us off in that Lake Union, kind of South Seattle-ish area, and then we'll work our way south from there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So our industrial market started in the Lake Union area where the Amazon campus is now. And really in those first couple of years of my career, I was cold calling in South Lake Union, not SoDo, South Lake Union.
That's interesting. I never knocked on a door.
Oh, you got to be kidding.
Never once. Like north of downtown.
Yeah, that's my first, by the way, I'm not going to name the client, but one of my initial deals that I did, actually one of the first one was Dawn Foods that I knocked on their door there and then ended up renewing them in two other deals I did with Dawn Foods. But they had a manufacturing plant there. So did Hostess and so did a couple other guys.
Yeah.
And then I moved a book company out of there as well. So guys were obviously moving out because at that time, Paul Allen was starting to acquire a lot of that stuff.
Right.
And so people were getting
redevelop. He was ahead of it.
Well, he had that idea of doing all that. And so that was the first, several months of my career. I was cold calling out there before I jumped down to actually South Seattle.
Yeah, because you started hitting South Seattle.
Right away. Yeah. So I did, as the market progressed, that's how I did my career. I started from north to south.
Yeah.
Okay. So then it took me about a year to go through the whole thing.
Yeah. By the way, I just skipped kind of that whole South Seattle thing and went straight down to
You just took your peanut butter and jelly sandwiches right down to Kent.
Kent Valley, baby. It was so awesome. Yeah.
So the market started. So the product there was really from the 1920s-ish. And then as you went into SoDo, it was 30s, 40s. That's why all the environmental plumes are down there and stuff. That was a lot of fill, out of that market. So that South Seattle market got saturated. Now I'm talking about south of the city from basically the stadiums down to the Duwamish. That got saturated into the 60s. And we got about between South Lake Union and that South Seattle corridor, about 60 million feet built out between 1920 and say 1960 of hardcore, down and dirty industrial buildings, most of which are still standing in the South Seattle market. Everything, obviously in the down here in South Lake Union, was tore down for Amazon and the like. But that market developed, and Boeing obviously went in there through the 60s, right? They obviously built their, it was prior to that. It was 30s, 40s when they built the airstrip and all that. And then they outgrew that into the 60s. That's when they went down into Kent, and they had to build the Howard Hanson Dam so that they could build product down there, because that, every year all of those fields would flood out.
Yeah.
And so they built the Howard Hanson Dam into the 60s, and that took us down to your territory.
The Kent Valley, baby.
That's right.
It was love at first sight, man, when I went down there. But really, I think that progression kind of started happening in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Really, like the South Seattle movement into the Kent Valley. In fact, I remember my dad was a truck driver, and the company that when I was young, they worked out of Lake Union. It was Allied Van Lines.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a big warehouse in Lake Union, basically on Denny. And then his boss, his name was Al, and he moved him down to Kent in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And he could have they're still in the same building. They're in the Western Van Moving and Storage building. It's just off of West Valley Highway on like 192nd. But anyway, it's a 45,000 square foot building. At that time in the 80s, when they moved down, he could have bought the building for $1 million. And obviously 45,000, square feet is worth a heck of a lot more than that.
Yeah,
today.
right.
It's double digits, right?
Yeah,
But that progression started happening from South Seattle into the Kent Valley, and mainly Kent, I would say,
yes.
Right? I mean, because Tukwila started getting built out, and there were some warehouses there, but then Kent really started getting big in the 80s.
Well, Boeing is the primary builder and occupier.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So they went down there, and then everything started kind of filling in around it,
That's right.
getting developed over the next, call it 20 years, is when that main kind of development of the Kent Valley happened, right?
That's right.
And you could still, like, even when we got in the business in, call it 2003, 2004, there was still some land left in Kent.
Sure, there was development.
Yeah, and now none.
Yeah.
We say none.
At the beginning of our career, you had that Oakdale Commerce Center and all the 212 stuff went in. A lot of new product. You had the flex parks go in and kind of those last sites, right? It wasn't redevelopment; it was just remaining sites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the valley's been kind of built out, and a lot of that stuff was built 24-foot clear, because at that time that was like the new standard. Like, wow, we're going from 18-foot clear in South Seattle to 24 in the Kent Valley. And then a lot of those parks were built because we weren't that big of a market at that point, in the sense of, like, there weren't big box deals running around all the time. So a lot of those parks were built to accommodate tenants 20 to 100,000 square feet. 100,000 square feet was a big deal in the early 2000s, and then it started.
A big deal.
Yes. And then,
by the way, I remember when I was cold calling all that South Seattle stuff and moving those guys down to Kent.
Yeah.
I would say 30 years newer product, 30% less rates.
Yeah.
30-30.
Yeah. 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 You moved
ESPN stole that 30-30 from me.
They got it from Matty McGregor. Yeah. So Kent started getting built out, and then basically, I would say, like, when we got into the business in the early kind of 2000s, 2003, 2004, through like 2008 is when the Sumner boom happened.
Oh, man.
So why don't you talk about that, and then how amazing it was to go from 24-foot clear to 30-foot clear down there, and all the good stuff that happened down there.
And by the way, Auburn wasn't skipped, right?
Correct.
Auburn, and I always say, Sumner's kind of Algona too, right?
Yeah.
But, Auburn wasn't skipped. It was really... Auburn always wanted to be manufacturing. There wasn't a lot of land that they wanted to allocate for industrial. So it wasn't skipped. It was just slowly developed, right?
Yeah.
There are little pockets in there. But skipping down to Sumner, you're right. That right at the beginning of our career, it was like, Panattoni was booming down there, right? They were way ahead of it. But it was difficult to move clients down there because, you might as well have said we were going to Oregon. Right.
Yeah.
So it was that same concept of trying to get guys to go from Seattle to Kent. And then you're telling the Kent guys, hey, if you want to grow, right, you can get a brand new building right down here. Go from 24 to 30-foot clear. ESFR was, the new thing. And you could get these brand new buildings at, a 20% discount from Kent.
Yeah.
And so Kent was starting to age. And so it was really larger tenants that you were pulling down there.
Yes.
Right. And Sumner was a boom town. And if you recall, that interchange, I mean, a lot of the buildings, obviously Corliss, kicked it off too down there. A lot of the buildings you had to access by getting off on that Algona exit and going down Valentine, into the Sumner district prior to the 24th interchange going in.
Yeah.
And so we always tell developers, if you have a good location, you don't necessarily need that access right away, right?
Right.
Sumner is the proof of that.
Yes.
A lot of that was done. But you had a lot of guys go in there and build spec product, and it did suffer for a while. Remember, there were some buildings that did not lease for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember really learning about Sumner with Pacific Crest Cabinets. They were in Kent, and, I found them on a cold call, and we went through the whole thing of a build-to-suit sale. And they ended up going down to Sumner.
That's right.
185,000 square foot building. This was like 2005. But boy, I learned everything there was to know about Sumner at that point, because we were looking down there.
Yes.
And when we first started, they were saying, no, we got to stay close in. Let's look at Kent. We'll go buy another building, stay in Kent. And then they said, let's consolidate everything under one roof, go build a brand new building down in Sumner. And I think I may be off by a little bit on this. I think we did the build-to-suit sale at like $55 a foot or something ridiculous.
That probably sounds right.
Yeah. And on that building. And so Sumner really started getting built out and
becoming the number one absorption market for over a decade.
Yeah. I mean, it is as good of a submarket as we have to this day in the Puget Sound region.
I would say you and I have done more deals in Sumner than any other municipality, period. Right?
Yeah. I mean, Kent, over the years, there's been a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. But maybe it is Kent. But you're right. I mean, if you look at it on a map, it logistically, and it's going to get better, obviously, with the connection of 167 into the port, but it's very close to the Port of Tacoma,
Yeah.
right? And 3PLs love the Port of Tacoma. It's not far away from the Port of Seattle. It's very close to the labor pool. And it had land,
Yeah.
right, where Auburn didn't. And Kent obviously saturated at about 100 million feet. So then when it got built out, for about 10 years, it was 38% of the entire state's absorption before it ran out. Now it's way down from that now, statistically, only because, not because of lack of interest,
Yeah.
but because there's no product.
Yeah.
And I would say at that same time, we kind of missed this segment. Obviously, Seattle and Tacoma built out at the same time,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
So you had the old district of Tacoma and South Seattle building out at the same time. And then your favorite market kind of came on in the 90s, right, which was Fife.
Yeah.
Fife,
And I
that
didn't know what
pure-
Fife really was in the 90s, but
Yeah.
when I got into business, I sure loved it. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Again, a smaller market,
Yeah.
but built some great product. A lot of institutional players came in there. And you, I mean, from the day I met you, you were like Mr. Fife.
Oh, I loved Fife because it was I-5 access, Port of Tacoma.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's just a lot to love about Fife.
Fife.
Plus,
I like Fife.
plus, like, my wife grew up in that area, so, like, I really
Yeah.
loved Fife.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Near and dear to my heart.
So Fife and the Puyallup Basin, all that kind of got developed in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Obviously still being developed today, but for the most part, the mass absorption of mass product got dumped there in the 90s.
Yeah. And then why don't you talk about how, okay, so those markets got built out, and Sumner in the early 2000s crushed it. Then we start talking Lakewood, Lacey, DuPont, and Frederickson.
Well, you kind of jumped, right? So Lakewood was always
Kind of there. Yeah.
It was kind of like Seattle to Kent. It was a little bit of the discount market to Tacoma.
Mm-hmm.
So product got trickled in there, right? But the big development jumped down to DuPont and Lacey
Yeah.
because it was on the I-5,
Right.
right? And so I would say DuPont and Lacey, and we could debate this, always struggled a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it struggled because it was a little far, right?
Yeah.
And the drayage was up there, and it was just a little removed from the valley. And so it's always trickled.
Yeah.
A little bit of product, a little bit of product, a little tough to lease, And so, it just was a little bit beyond where that growth would have been. If it was maybe 10 miles in further, right? And then comes along Frederickson,
Yeah.
right?
Boom.
Boom.
Yeah.
And I think because of, it got skipped, and we've talked about this on other podcasts, it got skipped over for a very long time because it was not on a major corridor.
It wasn't on 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it got skipped over, and DuPont and Lacey got, developed. And then it, obviously there were early comers that, with Boeing and Whirlpool and IKEA that saw what the promise of Frederickson was on a location, which is, as a bird flies, only 11 miles out of the Port of Tacoma.
Yeah.
Right. And the beauty of it, discovered, I think, by Best Buy, right?
Yeah, they were one of the first,
First
Boeing
of this generation,
cycle.
this cycle, to say, wait a minute, we're not going to look at DuPont and Lacey. We're not going to, we're going to move out of Kent. We're going to go in here because it's got wonderful access, right? It's got, several roads going into it as opposed to one,
Mhm.
right? And I think we counted, 14 lanes over 3 exits going into it that were not all great. A couple of them, better than others, but it was statistically very easy to get in and out, and not a lot of people traveling on those roads, as opposed to getting to DuPont and Lacey. You had 6 lanes on I-5 and a lot of people using it. And if there was one wreck, then you didn't have way around it.
You're in trouble. Yeah.
So Frederickson takes off in 2018 and 19, and now continues to be the number 1 absorption market, and will be for the next few years, right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the corporate tenant base that's there. There's zero doubt about that market anymore.
No question.
Yeah, obviously the labor is fantastic. I mean,
Yeah.
It is a really proven market. It had the same
It
kind of
replaced Summer.
success as Summer.
That's right.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
very similar to that. And then I guess, what's left, you start thinking of, Chehalis and Centralia and some of those markets as you continue to go further and further south. Those markets don't have anywhere near the tenant velocity as the other markets that we just mentioned. But those markets, continue to be in play, and they are bigger box type markets, but those are markets that we always keep an eye on as well.
Sure. They're I think primarily build to suit. There's been some spec development, and people have done, pretty good down there on that.
Yeah.
So there'll be continue to be spec development, but I think, much smaller quantities of it, mostly now that, the COVID boom is over.
Yeah.
But then you continuously have developers, not that we're skipping over these areas, but we're seeing success in areas like obviously Bonnie Lake. And I think every broker has explored everything on the east side, right?
Yeah.
To look at those corridors to say, how can we fill it in? Because these are, it's closer to the port systems than, Centralia or Winlock and these areas. How can we develop the land? The issue is always, infrastructure of roads getting in and out of there, right?
That's right.
There's definitely land out there, but it's how accessible is it?
Yeah.
And so those will continue. We'll see, areas developed on the east side, up the 18, up 90, in those areas that have had success, but it's more limited because of access.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's kind of the overview of the Puget Sound
That's
market
right.
and how it has developed over the years in a 20-minute or so podcast. But what a market, what a what a ride it's been to see, this industrial market really develop. When we started, it was not considered really a core market, right?
That's
Now
right.
it's considered one of the top 5 markets in the US if you ask anybody.
For sure.
And
Top 4 port system.
yeah, and I'll
Yep.
take full credit for that, putting
It's
the
all on
Puget
you.
Sound on the map.
That's right.
But no, it's a great market. We're lucky to be in it, and it'll be awesome to continue to watch it develop.
That's right. Thanks for listening.